Space, the final frontier. That opening narration sets a certain tone, doesn't it? A tone of possibility and adventure, of mysteries to explore, and fantastic new worlds to discover. Over these last 60 years, Star Trek has delivered on the promise made in that voiceover. We have watched our heroes visit strange new worlds, encounter new life, and boldly go as far as the imaginations of their creators could take them. But along the way, they also found something that isn't mentioned in that narration. And I'm betting something that isn't listed in the recruitment literature for Starfleet either. Pain. Also fear, sickness, injury, violence, war, death, all that good stuff. Seeing as how so many different characters have experienced so many different kinds of physical and emotional torment over the years, and seeing as how, unfortunately, so many of us have had to deal with some of those same torments in our own lives, I figured it might be useful to take a few minutes, or maybe more than a few minutes, to take a look at how Star Trek characters actually deal with trauma. The thing about the question of how Star Trek characters deal with the trauma they experience is the further back into the history of the franchise you go, the easier that question is to answer, because once you arrive at Star Trek, the original series, the answer is usually they don't deal with it. Captain Kirk and his crew aboard the Starship Enterprise are a hardy bunch. Over and over again, they encounter hostile aliens, find themselves trapped on threatening planets, watch their shipmates die, never members of the senior staff, thank God, and endure numerous other hardships. But no matter how bad things get, by the time we fade in on that next episode, everybody's fine. This is mainly the result of the format of the show, which was rigidly episodic and required that everything be reset to the status quo at the start of each new installment. It's also due in part to the storytelling philosophy that guided the creators of Star Trek, and basically every other TV show at the time. The story was in the solving of the problem, the dealing with the crisis, the conflict with the villain, not in how the heroes dealt with the lingering effects after it was all over. That's the approach the writers of Star Trek took. However, that doesn't mean we don't ever see our heroes struggling with the traumas they've experienced. They don't always pick themselves up, dust themselves off, and move on to the next adventure right away. Even the usually unflappable Captain Kirk lets us see that he's not completely emotionally bulletproof. Sure, 9 times out of 10, he can survive anything the universe can throw at him and still be snapping off one-liners with Spock and McCoy by the end of the hour, but every once in a while, he lets us see that he's still human. Sometimes it's just a moment, like the ending of The City on the Edge of Forever, when he returns to his own time after witnessing the death of his love, Edith Keeler, and orders the landing party to return to the Enterprise with a terse, tense, let's get the hell out of here. Sometimes what happens to him in the episode is so devastating he can't pull himself together at all, like at the end of Requiem for Methuselah, when Kirk is so distraught by the death of Reyna, an android who was destroyed by the emotions Kirk himself awakened within her, that Spock finds it necessary to remove Kirk's pain with a mind meld. And sometimes Kirk's attempt to deal with his trauma takes up an entire episode, like The Conscience of the King, when Kirk suspects the leader of a traveling troupe of actors is really the war criminal who executed 4,000 residents of a colony where Kirk lived as a child. At one point, McCoy asks Kirk what he's after, justice or vengeance. Kirk says he doesn't know. He becomes obsessed with proving that the actor, Anton Karidian, is Kodos the Executioner, and he refuses to settle for anything but absolute certainty. Even when Spock concludes that Karidian and Kodos are the same man, Kirk still insists on pushing for more evidence. Is it because he wants to be sure he doesn't accuse an innocent man of a terrible crime? Or is it because he knows if Karidian is Kodos, then he, Kirk, will have to finally confront the trauma he's kept buried for the last 20 years? For Kirk, and seemingly for the rest of the classic Trek crew, trauma isn't something to confront or to overcome, but something to carry. This state of affairs is carried on when the classic Trek crew graduates from TV to the movies. Kirk goes through some trauma on the big screen too, and while we see his pain a lot more clearly than we usually did on TV, his way of dealing with it, or not dealing with it, remains the same. Kirk is devastated by the death of Spock in Star Trek II. He delivers an emotional eulogy for his friend. At the start of the next film, that would be Star Trek III, I'll keep count, you don't need to worry about it, Kirk characterizes Spock's death as an open wound, but that's in private in his captain's log. Outwardly, Kirk is determined to move on. When McCoy breaks into Spock's quarters, Kirk is initially annoyed. "Why is everyone around here so obsessed with Spock?" he basically says. "God, just get over it." Kirk is fortunate that by the end of Star Trek III, Spock is back. One less trauma for Kirk to carry. But that trauma is replaced by another, perhaps even greater one. The death of Kirk's son, David. The moment when he realizes that David has been murdered by Klingons on the surface of the Genesis planet is as emotionally raw as we ever see Kirk. He staggers backwards, he stumbles and falls, missing his captain's chair. He mutters, "Klingon bastards, you've killed my son once, and then again," as though he can barely understand the words even as he says them. He gets a little bit of a catharsis when he kicks Krug, the Klingon commander who ordered David's death, off of a cliff to his death. I'm sure that felt good. I'm positive that felt great. In fact, if I had a child and someone murdered my child, and then I got the chance to kick that person off of a cliff, I would absolutely do it. And if they somehow survived and later on I got the opportunity to kick them off of a cliff again, I would 100% do it again. I would murder them as many times as I had the chance to, but as amazing as it would feel to do every single time, it wouldn't bring my murdered hypothetical child back, just as killing Krug didn't bring Kirk's son David back. That grief, that trauma, is something Kirk has to carry. That stoic, stiff upper lip, keep calm and carry on way of dealing with things is mostly continued throughout Star Trek The Next Generation as well. TNG is also an episodic show. TNG also usually resets to the status quo after every adventure, but TNG introduces a couple of innovations to help its heroes deal with their trauma. First, there's a mental health professional, allegedly, on the ship. And not just on the ship, she's usually on the bridge, sat right next to the captain. Counselor Troy is a betazoid who can sense the emotions of others. The reason she's on the bridge so often is that she's supposed to be using her empathic abilities to advise the captain. Her advice isn't usually worth very much, but that's not her fault. The writers of the show usually had no idea what to do with her. However, beyond her role as the captain's advisor, she was also the in-flight therapist for everyone else on the ship. We rarely see her actually doing this job, and we almost never see her doing it with one of her fellow main characters, but in theory, that's what she's doing. Unlike on Kirk's Enterprise, if someone aboard the Enterprise D is having a hard time working through some of the trauma they experienced during the course of their travels, they have someone to talk to about it. The second innovation in this area introduced to Star Trek by TNG is the trauma episode. This is an episode where, for a change, the story is not in the solving of the problem, the dealing with the crisis, or the conflict with the villain. Instead, the episode is about how our heroes deal with the lingering effects of something bad that happened already, the stuff that we usually skip over. There aren't a lot of trauma episodes in TNG. In fact, and please feel free to correct me on this in the comments, I think there's only one. Family, the second episode of Season 4. It's the episode that follows the second half of the Best of Both Worlds two-parter, which is appropriate. If TNG was ever going to do a trauma episode, that was the time to do it. The attack by the Borg, which included the abduction of Captain Picard and his transformation into Locutus, was the most traumatic event of the entire series. The episode centers Picard, but also features intervals where we see how other members of the Enterprise crew are dealing with the aftermath of the battle with the Borg. Beverly Crusher hauls out a trunk of her dead husband's belongings, which includes a message he recorded for Wesley. Worf welcomes his parents aboard, and they fumble for a way to show support for him without invading his privacy or offending his fragile pride. And I do mean fragile pride. Speaking of how Star Trek characters deal with trauma, Jesus Christ, do any of them deal with it worse than Worf? This is the guy whose go-to move when he feels a moment of personal weakness is to rush to his quarters and jam a knife in his chest. No, Worf, don't do it. So what if Geordi called your bluff at the poker game? You can come back from this, man. That's not entirely fair. Worf only runs for his seppuku knife when he fears that he isn't strong enough to overcome some personal obstacle, like insomnia or having a big plastic barrel fall on him. When trauma comes in the form of, say, someone he loves being murdered, he goes for his revenge killing sword. Oh yeah. Anyway, the Enterprise itself is docked for repairs. This ship and these people have taken damage, and they need time and help to heal, and none more so than Captain Picard, who starts the episode insisting to Counselor Troi that he's fine, and before it's over, finds himself covered in mud alongside his brother Robert, sobbing, "I should have been able to stop them, but I wasn't strong enough. I wasn't good enough." Robert tells him, "What's happened to you is going to be with you a long time, Jean-Luc. You'll have to carry it with you." The thing Picard realizes in this moment is that he doesn't have to carry it alone. As I said, TNG isn't that different from TOS in that it's also a very episodic series that hits the reset button before the start of the next show. After Family, Picard's Borg trauma is mostly forgotten about. It's mentioned here and there, but he seems pretty over it. He even encounters Borg a couple more times and holds it together seemingly with no problem. But then, in the film Star Trek First Contact, when the Borg attempt another invasion of Earth, Picard's trauma resurfaces. This time, Robert is not around, so Picard deals with it by killing a bunch of Borg and at one point going off on an epic rant about how he's not motivated by revenge. He's just going to make the Borg pay for what they've done. Why are you being so weird about this, Lily? I told you, I'm an enlightened man of the future. I don't indulge in anything so primitive as vengeance. Now, have you seen my Borg killing gun? Robert was right. Picard does have to carry it with him. Even years later, he can feel the weight of it pulling him down again all of a sudden. In First Contact, he's just like he is at the beginning of Family. He thinks he's over it. He thinks he's fine. He's not. There's another episode of TNG I want to mention, Schisms, from Season 6. This isn't a trauma episode in the sense that we see characters dealing with the aftermath of something. Instead, they struggle to understand what's happening to them as it's happening. Riker, Worf, Geordi, and others on the crew begin experiencing strange symptoms, sleeplessness, dizziness, sudden feelings of being trapped or being threatened, missing time. Because this is Star Trek, of course, it turns out that these symptoms are all the result of the crew being abducted by aliens from another dimension, who then wipe their memories before returning them to the Enterprise. However, what's interesting about this episode to me isn't the specifics of the trauma itself, but the way we see the characters dealing with it and how they use the advanced technology at their disposal to help them. In what is probably the most well-remembered scene from the episode, several of the characters who have been having these unexplained symptoms gather with Counselor Troi in the holodeck, working together, using the holodeck to give their fragmented memories a tangible form. They gradually piece together the image of a sinister-looking metal table with restraints and attached tools, and a dark room filled with ominous clicking noises. It's an investigation, but it's also a kind of therapy. Before they can confront and overcome their trauma, they need to comprehend it, to know what is making them feel what they're feeling. One character who doesn't get a trauma episode is the Enterprise's original security chief, Tasha Yar. This is a little surprising when I think about it, given how over-the-top grim her backstory is. Tasha grew up on a failed colony and apparently spent her childhood dodging roving gangs of men who were constantly on the lookout for people to sexually assault. This traumatic background is mentioned a couple of times during Tasha's one and only season on the show, but it never really becomes a focus of either the show or of Tasha's character, which isn't necessarily bad. She had a rough time growing up, she escaped, she's not defined by her trauma, good for her. It just feels a little odd that the creators of the show went so far out of their way to give her such an intensely traumatic backstory, and then mostly just put it down and stepped away from it. The most traumatic event associated with Tasha that is actually important in the show is her abrupt death in the episode Skin of Evil. That event not only changes the structure of the cast, Denise Crosby, who played Tasha, leaves the show, and as a result, Michael Dorn's Worf gets a promotion to Chief of Security and a lot more screen time, it also contributes to the development of other characters, namely Data, whose lingering attachment to Tasha and her memory becomes one of his most poignantly human traits. In an inventive twist, Tasha's death even contributes to the development of her own character. Sort of. She reappears in the classic TNG episode Yesterday's Enterprise, existing in an alternate timeline where she was never killed, but thanks to Guinan's unique ability to perceive things beyond time, Tasha learns that she died in the other timeline. Guinan intensifies the sting of that by calling it an empty death, and decides to make her life in this timeline count for something by leaving the Enterprise and going back in time on a mission that will almost certainly result in her being killed again, but will also restore the original timeline. It does restore the original timeline, and then a couple of seasons later, Denise Crosby shows up again to play the character of Sela, who, it turns out, is the daughter of that alternate timeline version of Tasha and a Romulan officer who took her prisoner after she traveled back in time. And that story, like Tasha's backstory, is a generous portion of grim with a side order of grim, so her life was traumatic and tragic, but at least it was symmetrical. TNG's spin-off, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, generally does a better job at long-term character development. Its heroes grow and change in much more noticeable and dramatic ways through the course of the series than the crew of the Enterprise D ever do. But when it comes to the crew of DS9 dealing with the traumas they experience, the show still mostly sticks to the episodic approach, with the occasional trauma episode here and there. Mostly. Deep Space Nine distinguishes itself from TNG through more than superior character development. Its premise is that Starfleet has established an outpost on the titular space station in order to help the nearby planet of Bajor recover from a brutal, decades-long military occupation by the Cardassians. That premise is inseparable from the trauma experienced by the Bajoran people. Major Kira, the series' second lead, is a survivor of that occupation. She grew up in refugee camps. She fought against the Cardassians as a member of the Resistance. She carries the emotional baggage of what the Cardassians did to her and her family, and of what she did to the Cardassians. She's committed acts of terrorism. She's killed people. At the start of the series, she resents Starfleet's presence, seeing it as yet another form of occupation. And she hates Cardassians and views them all as the same. As the series goes on, Kira continues to carry that anger, that hatred, but she comes to a point where she no longer allows herself to be led by it. She holds the Cardassian state and war criminals like Gul Dukat responsible for their crimes, but she comes to respect other Cardassians who opposed the occupation or who are now trying to atone for their sins. And she eventually accepts that Starfleet, and specifically Captain Sisko, are friends and allies that Bajor can rely on for assistance, not invaders looking to do a more benign form of what Cardassia did. Deep Space Nine comes up with its own spin on the trauma episode in Season 4, in the episode Hard Time. In this one, Chief O'Brien, the patron saint of suffering in Star Trek, is falsely accused of a crime while on an alien world and sentenced to a 20-year virtual prison sentence, meaning that while he will experience all 20 years in what feels like real time, only a few hours will pass in the real world, outside of the virtual prison. The episode begins just as O'Brien is completing his virtual sentence. In his mind, he's been locked up for 20 years, but suddenly there's Major Kira. And then a short while later, he's back on DS9 with his wife and daughter and all his colleagues, and it's as though no time has gone by at all. Because, in reality, No time has gone by. O'Brien tries to do the standard Star Trek protagonist thing and carry his trauma quietly and alone, but that doesn't work so well. He struggles returning to his old routine. He retains habits he picked up in prison, like hoarding food, and he is haunted by visions of Ichar, his cellmate. As the episode progresses, we cut back and forth between O'Brien in the present and flashbacks of his time in prison. We get to see the trauma itself and its aftermath shown to us in parallel. Eventually, it's revealed that O'Brien isn't just dealing with the memories of 20 years spent in a brutal alien prison cell, but with guilt. In the last days of his sentence, O'Brien killed Ichar over a misunderstanding. That's why the vision of Ichar keeps appearing to him. After losing his temper with his young daughter Molly, O'Brien, convinced that there is no coming back from what he's been through and what he's done, flees to a cargo bay and prepares to end his own life. Dr. Bashir finds O'Brien with a phaser pressed under his chin and is able to talk him out of it. The episode ends with O'Brien happily reunited with his family after receiving a prescription for antidepressants from Bashir and committing to attend regular counseling sessions. That scene when O'Brien is alone in the cargo bay with that phaser to his chin, that might be the most alone we've ever seen a Star Trek character. It's one of the darkest and also one of the most painfully human moments in the entire franchise. O'Brien is broken. He's at a point where he doesn't think he can take anymore. He has suffered enough. This is Star Trek. These guys, gals, and in some cases NB pals of ours aren't supposed to sell like this. They're supposed to shake it off, get over it, back to work, move on. Not this time. O'Brien doesn't think he can move on. In that darkest of moments, he has decided that it's too much. And if Bashir doesn't show up to talk him down, well, I think we all know what was about to happen. The thing is, though, even Hard Time is only one episode. We see O'Brien struggling, but the next time we see him, he seems his usual self. And the events of Hard Time aren't mentioned going forward. So it's a great episode, and it's a more direct and honest depiction of how trauma can affect people than we usually get from Star Trek. But in terms of formatting, it's not really a departure. It's still containing the trauma and the aftermath to a single episode. Deep Space Nine does transcend that format a little later, however, in a story that spans multiple episodes and centers on one of its best and most unexpectedly compelling characters, Nog. The overall journey of Nog from the start of the series to the end is one of the greatest accomplishments of the creators of Deep Space Nine, an accomplishment shared and made possible in the first place by the performance of Aaron Eisenberg, the actor who played Nog. Beginning as a typical scheming, troublemaking Ferengi kid, Nog eventually enrolls in Starfleet Academy, becomes a member of the crew aboard the Defiant, and in the latter portion of the series, sees combat while serving in the war against the Dominion. During one such combat experience, in the episode The Siege of AR-558, Nog is seriously injured and needs to have one of his legs amputated. When he returns to Deep Space Nine a couple of episodes later, in the episode It's Only a Paper Moon, he's physically recovered for the most part. His leg has been replaced, but is still badly wounded mentally and emotionally. Still on medical leave, he begins spending all of his time in the holosuite, living with the holographic lounge singer Vic Fontaine, losing himself in the imaginary world of Vic's program, an idealized version of Las Vegas in the 1960s. It's Only a Paper Moon is a departure in several ways from how Star Trek has shown characters dealing with trauma up to this point. Firstly, it's part of a multi-episode arc. We see the traumatic events themselves in an earlier episode, and now we get another episode fully devoted to the what comes next. Though, now that I think about it, that's kind of the same thing TNG did with The Best of Both Worlds and Family. The only difference is the Borg invasion affected everybody, whereas It's Only a Paper Moon zeroes in on a trauma that only directly affected Nog. The big departure is that the episode picks up at the point when the character has usually already worked through their issues and is ready to get back to work. Nog is injured in the siege of AR-558, is then absent for the following episode, Covenant, then returns in It's Only a Paper Moon with a new leg and having undergone physical therapy and all of that. He's supposed to be better now. He had a rough time in the war, but he took an episode to work all that stuff out off screen, and now he's back. So that's that, right? Not this time. This episode defies expectations in another, more subtle way as well. There's no crisis to pull Nog out of his depression and force him to get back to work. In a more typical episode, Nog would lose himself in his holosuite fantasy, but at some point, something would happen, there'd be some threat to the station, and Nog would be compelled to return to duty, and in the course of helping to save the day, he would discover, to his amazement, that he's stronger than he thought he was, that he's ready to face the challenges ahead, that he's all better. Essentially, circumstances would arise that would fix him all at once. That doesn't happen. There's no action plot. There is no sudden peril to the station to press Nog back into action. The episode is just about him and Vic Fontaine and their relationship, and Nog trying to escape his life and ultimately accepting that he can't escape it for good, that he has to leave the holosuite and face what has happened to him and find a way to live with it. Speaking of people who find a way to live with it, I can't move on from Deep Space Nine without talking about this guy, though I'm not going where you might think after that segue. I've talked about trauma episodes a few times here, and I was thinking, Deep Space Nine kind of starts out with a trauma episode, doesn't it? The pilot, Emissary. It's at least a trauma episode where Sisko is concerned. We open with the death of his wife and the destruction of his ship back during the Borg attack from Best of Both Worlds, and then the episode builds to a moment when Sisko is communicating with the prophets inside the Bajoran wormhole, and they observe that even though his wife's death occurred years ago, he still hasn't moved on. You exist here, they tell him, as he relives the last time he saw her. If classic Trek and TNG make it clear that trauma is something we have to carry, DS9 reminds us that no matter how long we've carried it, or how light the burden may come to feel with the passage of time, we never quite forget that it's there. And sometimes the most difficult part of carrying it is picking it up in the first place. Voyager mostly offers minor variations on themes from TNG, when it comes to depicting trauma and everything else. But there are a couple of examples worth mentioning. First and foremost is the way 7 of 9's time as a Borg drone is dealt with. It's similar to Picard's experience, with the major difference being that Picard was only a Borg for, a few days? 7 was assimilated into the Borg collective as a child, and wasn't separated from it until, I don't know, how old is she supposed to be? Mid-20s? Picard's challenge is returning to his normal life after a brutalizing but brief experience. For 7, being a Borg was her normal life. She barely remembers what it's like to be a human, to be an individual. 7's story is analogous to someone who was abducted into a cult at a young age and not returned to their family and life outside the cult until after they'd grown up. That's a different sort of trauma than we see other Star Trek heroes having to deal with. And it's a struggle for 7. She's one of the few characters on Voyager to get a long-term character arc, and hers is all about how difficult it is for her to adjust to living in a community based on cooperation rather than enslavement. She's not much of a team player at first. She has trouble learning to trust others. She's not great at compromise. She has to figure all of that stuff out. She has to decondition herself. The other example I want to mention from Voyager is The Doctor, and specifically an episode from Season 5 called Latent Image. In this one, the Doctor, who is a hologram, discovers that someone has been tampering with his program, erasing his memories of a recent traumatic event. He investigates and discovers that the person responsible for this is none other than Captain Janeway. So, what had happened was, the Doctor was on an away mission with Harry Kim and a red shirt named Ensign Jatal. Well, technically a gold shirt, given the division colors in this area, but you know what I mean. Their shuttlecraft is attacked by a hostile alien, and both Kim and Jital are seriously injured. By the time they get back to Voyager, there's only time for the Doctor to save the life of one of them. Forced to choose, the Doctor chooses Harry. And he saves Harry. But Jital dies. After that happens, the Doctor experiences a period of profound self-doubt. He second-guesses every decision he makes because he's so troubled by the fact that he chose to save Harry, the one he was personally closest to, and not Jital, who he didn't know as well. He was programmed to be impartial, and yet he allowed his friendship with Harry to influence his decision. This contradiction between his original programming and the person he has become since being activated on Voyager kinda breaks the Doctor's brain. Janeway says, well, we can't have this. He's the only Doctor on the ship. So Janeway fixes it in the most bluntly efficient way she can. She opens up the Doctor's memories and she's like, computer, delete the red shirt. When the Doctor finds out about all this, he's furious, of course, and he freaks out all over again, and Janeway deactivates him. After discussing it with B'Elanna and Seven of Nine, Janeway's like, you know what? I'm gonna try treating the Doctor like a person instead of a fritzing toaster. And she reactivates him and takes him off duty and puts him up in the holodeck and just kind of sits with him and talks to him and helps him work through his feelings. What I find noteworthy about this episode in the context of the topic of this video is how it's not just about a character dealing with their trauma, it's about how a character deals with someone else's trauma. Captain Janeway initially makes a decision, altering the Doctor's memory, that is convenient for everybody else. It's the best decision for everyone but the Doctor, the traumatized person. And it works okay for a while, but eventually that repressed trauma resurfaces to cause problems all over again, and Janeway is forced to do what she should have done from the beginning: help the Doctor come to terms with his trauma, rather than trying to bury it. It's not convenient, it's not easy, it's not quick, but it's the healthy thing and the compassionate thing. Moving on to Enterprise, or as it was renamed in its third season to avoid any confusion, Star Trek Enterprise. At the start of that third season, planet Earth is attacked by the Xindi, hostile aliens from a remote region of the galaxy who send a probe to do a space 9/11, zapping Earth with a big old laser and killing millions of people in the process. This attack was a source of general trauma for most of the crew of Captain Archer's Enterprise, but was a personal tragedy for Chief Engineer Trip Tucker, whose sister was among those killed. Trip spends most of the season that follows trying not to deal with his sister's death. It clearly affects him deeply, but he doesn't openly express his grief until after Enterprise is badly damaged in a battle with some Xindi ships, and Trip is left with the task of writing to the families of some Enterprise crew members who were killed. As he struggles with composing a message to the family of one of his dead engineers, he realizes that he's been trying to cope with the death of his sister all this time by pretending that her death was nothing special, that she was just another one of the 7 million people killed in the Xindi attack. But she wasn't just another casualty. Not to him. She was his sister. He breaks down while talking about it to T'Pol and finally cries. Later, he's able to finish the letter he's been trying to write, and when he's done, he can finally say goodbye to his sister. Most of the trauma we see characters dealing with in Star Trek is caused by experiences they had themselves: an assault, an abduction, an injury to them. Trip's trauma, like that of Captain Kirk following the deaths of Spock and David, is rooted in what happens to someone else. He isn't injured in the Xindi attack. He's not even there. His trauma comes from the loss of a loved one. And one way or another, we all know what that feels like. The rebooted versions of the classic Trek crew depicted in the 3 Kelvin timeline movies experience their fair share of trauma. Spock's planet is blown up, Kirk's mentor is killed. Then Kirk himself dies and comes back to life. The Enterprise is destroyed, and most of the crew is captured by the villain. But there's not a lot in those films as far as the characters actually dealing with that trauma on screen. In the 2009 Star Trek film, Spock gets a scene or two of clearly being shaken by the destruction of Vulcan and the deaths of most of his people, and then it's back to work. If you really want to see characters in a recent Star Trek production not only experiencing what for most of us would be psyche-destroying levels of trauma, but dealing with it and talking about it on screen a lot, there's only one place to look. Yeah, baby. Star Trek Discovery, or maybe they should have called it Star Trek Discover Cry. Am I right? Because they cry a lot, I'm told. I never really thought the crying was unusual or excessive, but apparently some people had a big problem with it. Discovery is a show that gave certain people in the Star Trek fan base a lot of big feelings. Looking back on it now that it's complete, I find it flawed in some very frustrating ways, but I also like it a lot, and I'm glad it was made. One of the things I admire about it that is relevant to this context is the way it tried to show how its characters were affected by their harrowing experiences in ways that went beyond hitting the reset button from week to week or doing the occasional trauma episode and then getting back to business as usual. In each of its 5 seasons, Discovery attempted, mostly unsuccessfully, unfortunately, at least from where I was sitting, to tell big, serialized stories. Instead of a single story in each episode, there was a single story in each season, parceled out episode by episode, like chapters in a book. This is how most shows produced for streaming services are produced, and I'm not a fan of the approach because it almost never works, and it's fundamentally unsuited to a form that is episodic in nature. But it did at least give the writers of Discovery a built-in motivation to show how the events of the show continued to affect the characters beyond the episode in which those events occurred. In Season 1, there's Ash Tyler, who at first is haunted by memories of captivity at the hands of the Klingons, then is confronted by the shocking realization that, spoiler alert for TV episodes that came out almost 10 years ago, he actually is a Klingon whose appearance and memories were altered so that he could pass for human and be a sleeper agent. That'll throw anybody for a loop. One of Discovery's best trauma arcs, I guess that's what I'll call them, involves Tyler and also the characters of Paul Stamets and Hugh Culber. And it actually spans not only multiple episodes, but multiple seasons. In Season 1, Culber, a doctor, examines Tyler and finds out the truth that Tyler is a Klingon with a human appearance and personality artificially grafted onto him. This revelation triggers a violent response from Tyler, who immediately murders Culber. Tyler is eventually recruited into Section 31 and returns to Discovery in that capacity in Season 2. Then it turns out that Culber isn't dead. Not actually, not all the way. His, essence, soul, has been trapped in the mycelial network, which is the universe-spanning magic mushroom superhighway that Discovery uses to jump from place to place. The crew finds Culber in the mycelial network, and he's not doing great, but they manage to rescue him and return him to life with a new body and everything, and he is reunited with his husband, Stamets, and everything is okay now. Yay! Except it's definitely not, because getting murdered, spending months alone in a mycelial network, then suddenly being brought back to life isn't something Culber is able to just shake off. His marriage to Stamets, which seemed mostly happy before, goes through a rough patch. They separate. Culber needs space. Oh, and also Ash Tyler, the guy who murdered him, is back on the ship, just walking around free as a bird. Culber confronts Tyler in the mess hall. Tyler offers all the usual excuses. It wasn't me. I was a Klingon brainwashed to think I was human. Don't blame me. Blame the Klingons who psychologically conditioned me to snap your neck as soon as you learn my secret. But Culber needs to fight. So they fight. And when it's over, they don't exactly feel better, but they do have a moment of understanding. Culber says that he doesn't know who he is since he came back. Tyler offers that he knows what that feels like. Culber and Stamets eventually reconcile, and Discovery and most of its crew travel 900 years into the future at the end of Season 2, and it's at this point that Culber's trauma arc takes another turn, and he begins counseling some of his crewmates to help them deal with their own trauma, like Lieutenant Detmer, who struggles with PTSD after being at the helm of Discovery during a difficult crash landing when they first arrive in the 32nd century. He and Stamets also become surrogate parents to Adira, a young officer who joins Discovery's crew after the time jump, and their partner, Gray. Culber is not only able to put his own life back together, he also uses his own experience dealing with and overcoming trauma to help others deal with theirs. It's a long process and not a linear one, and we get to see it play out across multiple seasons of Discovery at a level of detail and attention that no Star Trek show had attempted before. The character of Book, who also joins the cast beginning in Season 3 after the time jump, experiences a similar long-term trauma arc. In Season 4, his planet is destroyed by a powerful gravitational anomaly that wreaks havoc across the galaxy. His anger and grief compel him to join forces with Tarka, who is building a weapon to destroy the anomaly, which could threaten the Federation's efforts to contact and make peace with the aliens who sent it. Book eventually realizes Tarka's isn't the side he wants to be on and does what he can to help out the good guys, and in the end the heroes prevail, but Book is forced to perform community service to atone for the crimes he committed with Tarka. The loss of his people and his world is devastating to Book, but like Culber, he is able eventually to move on and build a new life for himself. In the series finale, we skip a few decades further into the future to see that Book and the show's main character, Michael Burnham, have gotten married, settled down, raised a child. He lives through his trauma and tragedy and finds new life, new purpose, and contentment on the other side. Most of the major characters on Discovery experience a serious trauma. Many of them seem defined by their trauma, which, even when it's done well, can feel repetitive and uncreative. To be fair to the writers, this isn't just a Star Trek Discovery problem. This is a modern TV and movie problem. It seems at some point in the last 15 or 20 years, storytellers all kind of decided that the best way to establish motivation or impart some depth to a character, hero or villain, was to give them some terrible trauma to react to. I do wish Discovery hadn't leaned so heavily in this direction. Shit, their third season turns out to be one great big trauma arc that affects the entire galaxy. It gets to be too much after a while. Not only does it result in the series feeling like it's always playing the same emotional notes, it also obscures the times when the trauma arc actually works and produces some compelling characterization, like Culber, or Book, or my favorite Discovery character, Saru. Born on a planet where his species is raised as food for the scary monster people that dominate them, Saru's whole life is practically one big trauma arc. He spends the first season and a half of Discovery defined by fear, blessed and cursed with an ability to sense the approach of death. Then he begins to undergo a physical change that he believes will lead to his death. He doesn't know, since on his planet, his people always get eaten by their evil overlords before this happens. It turns out, though, that Saru isn't dying. He's just going through space puberty. And when he gets through that, he's no longer haunted by constant fear. He's an all-new Saru. He goes on to liberate his people from their hungry oppressors, not only freeing himself from his own trauma, but freeing his entire species from the generational trauma that has dictated their existence for as long as anyone can remember. Then he jumps 900 years into the future with the rest of the crew, serves as captain of Discovery for a while, becomes a Federation ambassador, and gets married to the president of Vulcan. Quite a recovery. Happy for you, buddy. None of the Star Trek shows that have followed Discovery has been quite as much of a trauma-rama, but we've still seen several of the characters go through some shit, or struggle to deal with some shit they went through before. On Strange New Worlds, Captain Pike has to live not with a past trauma, but with knowledge of a future trauma. He knows, thanks to an encounter with a Klingon time crystal, that in just a few years he will be involved in a terrible accident that will leave him scarred and confined to a beep chair. That fate casts a shadow that he knows he can't escape, but he resolves to make the most of the time he has left, to live life to the fullest and be of service as much as he can for as long as he can. We also see Dr. Mbenga experiencing some lingering PTSD from his service in the last Federation Klingon War, where it turns out he killed a whole bunch of people. He carries that around. La'an, the security chief, is a survivor of a Gorn attack when she was a child. The Gorn killed the rest of her family. It's a trauma that shaped her and set the course for her life. She carries that. In Star Trek Picard, we see a much older Jean-Luc Picard still grappling with the trauma of his Borg experience, even many decades later. In Season 2, he also confronts a long-buried trauma from his childhood, involving the death of his mother, which is almost as painful as the experience of watching Season 2 of Star Trek Picard. And though I'm not going to get into details, because this show is brand new and still being released as I'm making this video, Star Trek Starfleet Academy centers on several characters who are grappling with trauma resulting from things they have done and things which were done to them, including Captain Ake, who carries guilt about several consequential past decisions, and Caleb Meir, who has had to grow up alone after being separated from his mother by Starfleet. So it's not just a personal trauma, it's a trauma inflicted on him by the state. Where do they come up with this shit? There are other examples from all across the franchise that I didn't mention. If you have a It sounds weird to say, but if you have a favorite example of a Star Trek character dealing with trauma, tell me about it in the comments. Because Star Trek has been produced for so long in so many different forms, by so many different people, it can be a challenge to identify common themes that run through the entire franchise. But there are a few things we can learn from watching our heroes, and sometimes their adversaries, trying to find ways of living with the traumas they experience. One big lesson is that, for better and for worse, the traumas that touch our lives make us who we are. There's a well-remembered line from Star Trek V, when Captain Kirk angrily refuses to allow Sybok to take his pain away. I don't want my pain taken away. I need my pain. He doesn't say that because he likes pain or because he's glad the painful events in his life happened. He's not happy about having to let Edith Keeler die or the murder of his son, but he understands that to deny that those things happened and to deny that he has been shaped by them would be to deny himself. Dealing with trauma doesn't mean forgetting it or erasing it, which is an odd lesson to learn from a character like Kirk, who spent all 3 seasons of Star Trek the original series doing exactly that, at least as far as we ever saw. But there it is. We can't control what happens to us, and we can't just turn off the pain we feel. But we can make choices about what we want to happen next. We can survive. We can heal. We can grow stronger and wiser from our pain. We can use our pain to give us purpose. Most importantly, when we struggle, we can ask for help and give help to others who are struggling. As Star Trek shows us over and over again, from Picard to O'Brien, Nog, Seven of Nine, the Doctor, Culber, Book, and more, the best way to deal with trauma is to rely on each other. And the second best way, as Worf shows us, is to find the person who killed your baby mama and kill them back. Though maybe you shouldn't do that. You could get in a lot of trouble. Just fuck them up a little. I realize this shirt would have been more appropriate a few months ago when I did the What Does Star Trek Say About Fascism video, but the thing is, I didn't have it then. Better late than never. Hey folks, hope you enjoyed this one. I'm gonna let you know what the subject of the next Trek Actually video is gonna be, but before I do that, I want to give shout outs to some of my newest Patreon patrons and channel members. First, the new patrons. They are Dr. Shoebill. Thanks, Dr. Shoebill. Zarina Blue. Thanks, Zarina Blue. Michael Long. Thanks, Michael. Daniel Shrimshire. Thanks, Daniel. Kino. Thanks, Kino. Mike Coy. Thanks, Mike. Dragon Cobalt. Thanks, Dragon. Shy Fox. Thanks, Shy Fox. Berg 4077. Thanks, Berg. Zulu Romeo. Thanks, Zulu Romeo. And now the new channel members. They are Amy Ashen. Thanks, Amy. Diana Hoheimer 1107. Thanks, Diana. James Vaughn 7989. Thanks, James. Stacy Stone 5307. Thanks, Stacy. Dumpster Cheese. Thanks, Dumpster Cheese. If you want to support this channel, you can do so by going to patreon.com/Steve Shives or clicking the join button to become a member of this channel. All patrons and members get access to exclusive posts that allow you to vote in the polls that determine upcoming Trek Actually topics, and also submit questions ahead of time for my twice-monthly Ask Away live streams. If you pledge $5 a month or more on Patreon, or become a member at the $5 a month tier or higher, you get a shout out at the end of a Trek Actually video. If you'd rather give a one-time gift than a recurring monthly donation, you're always more than welcome to do that by clicking the thanks button right below the video, or via PayPal or Venmo. The links for those are in the video description. Many thanks. If you like what I do on YouTube, especially the Star Trek related stuff, you should also check out my side projects, The Ensign's Log, the Star Trek themed comedy podcast that I'm on alongside Jason Harding and Amanda Billings, and Trek Reluctantly, the watch-along stream Dana Cole and I do every Wednesday starting at 6 p.m. Eastern on this channel right here. As always, links in the description. Now for next month's Regulation Trek Actually topic, and do you know what I hate? I hate a misconception. Some of you may have heard that I actually like a misconception, but that is not true. There are a few widely held beliefs regarding Star Trek that, in my opinion at least, are misconceptions. And the next time around, I am going to attack one such misconception head-on with a video that tackles the question, do all Star Trek series actually have bad first seasons? That's next month. I'll be back then and a bunch of times before that, so until the next time you see me, whenever that is, thanks for watching, and take care, everybody.